Hey guys, Mr. Klein here with our lesson on the city-state of Sparta. Yes, Sparta. It's this Greek city-state that after Athens everybody knows about. It summarized what military bravery should be for generations and military strength even to today, to the future in video games and to great mascots. You tell them, Lee Corso. And also, feats of physical strength. But what's so important about Sparta, in our collective imagination as for us studying history? What's the big deal with them? Well, after Athens, the most important city-state in ancient Greece, like I said, was Sparta. It was not located in eastern Greece, rather it was located in southern Greece on the Peloponnese Peninsula. It's that big chunk which we'll look at on our map. So what we have is, of course, we have Athens right here, and as you can see in the southern parts of Greece on the Peloponnesus, this big chunk of land is Sparta. Unlike the societies that try to balance the economy, the freedom of its people, and the military, Sparta focused almost totally on creating a strong military and having a society dedicated to defending their city-state, because unlike Athens, its population was much smaller. Though the Spartan society left little in terms of archaeological ruins or writings, their influence on modern society can be seen today. This is one of the few archaeological sites of the city of Sparta that's left, a Greek religious temple. Now, in our next section, we're going to talk about how Spartan society was actually organized. So Spartan society was radically different than our own modern society. It was very heavily class-based, and in fact, it was very, very bottom-heavy. In other words, the vast majority of people who lived in the city-state of Sparta were of one particular social group, which we'll talk about here. Now, residents of Sparta, everybody worked to support the military, or in particular, the upper class of Sparta's city-state. Now, residents of Sparta were put into three different groups. The first ones, which we're going to talk about, were the Spartans. The Spartiates were the citizens of Sparta who served in the military. These guys were boys who began training to join the army at age 8. They joined the army at age 20. And only after the age of 30 were they able to get married, which is different in most Greek city-states. In fact, up until joining the army at age 20, it was considered to be normal for all Greek city-states. When you were 18 to 20, you had to join the military in Athens, for instance. But what was different is marriage was highly restricted in Sparta for that. Now, not only that, once they left their common dorms and stuff to get married and lead a family life, they still had to eat with their comrades until the age of 60. And they could only be accepted, by the way, into these military units without the unanimous consent of the people in the unit itself. Now, Spartiates only came from the founding families of the city-state. And the only other way you could become a Spartiate was if you were sponsored by someone from that. So generally what we consider as the Spartan army came from this wealthy class of citizens. And one thing to know about the Spartan military is that they almost exclusively trained to be infantry called hoplites, which were these guys that you see with the mask over their faces and stuff. That whenever we think of Spartans, that's where we get that from. The second group was the Perioiki. Okay, these were all of the remaining free residents of Sparta, and there was a smaller group kind of stuck in there also. They did the jobs that were illegal for Spartiates to do, which was pretty much anything but trained to be in the army. They were also the only people to be able to leave the city-state without government permission. They kind of enjoyed their status because even though in times of war they could be called up as soldiers, they were free to make money. For instance, Spartans couldn't hold money or gold. It was punishable by death. And these were the descendants of the first peoples that the Spartan army managed to take over. So their lives really were, apart from being in almost a military dictatorship, much like the people of Athens, except that they couldn't vote, which foreigners couldn't do in Athens anyway, so their lives were pretty similar in that regard. The vast majority of members of the Spartan city-states were actually the Helots. These were the slaves that made up almost 90% of Sparta's population. The vast majority were captured during wars, and these guys had essentially no rights. They were farmers. Their jobs were just to farm the land owned by the Spartiates. Helots were regularly beaten, and in an annual ceremony, in order to prevent them from getting a rebellion going, because after all, they made up 90% of the population, the Spartiates declared war on the Helots and actually killed slaves. In fact, according to some historical sources, a Spartiate couldn't become a full member of the military unless they snuck up on and killed a Helot, because, they had to show their military prowess. Some of those sources are kind of questioned. So Helots generally had a really terrible life. Essentially no, fancy clothing, they could be beaten, and any of that stuff was the life for them. So in our next section aren't too important for what we're going to be talking about for our purposes, but they really do set apart Sparta from other Greek city-states and other societies we studied this year, and we'll go through this in the next section. Okay, so for Spartiates, you actually had some very important responsibilities. Spartan citizens were considered to be servants of the city-state of Sparta. They were considered individuals, but the individual's primary duty was to take care of the city-state of Sparta itself. And their lives were built around this purpose. Spartiates were required by law to do the following things. First off was that the men were, of course, required to serve in the army, which was nothing special. Men all over Greece were drafted into their city-state's army. And generally because they were landed gentry, they were wealthy men, they had farmland provided to them by the government, and it was passed down through the family, but it was divided equally, which over time meant that you owned less and less land. Having said that, men in the Spartiates were required by law to provide enough food for the members of their army unit, because if you remember in the last section I said that they all would meet at night for the evening meal as a part of their military unit, and then from ages 20 to 30 they had to actually live with their members of their unit. Now, there is some debate over how much time that the Spartiates spent on military training, but we do know that when it came to combat, no, not really 300 were they all muscle-bound dudes who could, beat people to death with shields for no reason. These guys were, however, really, really good at unit tactics. They could march in the battle instead of running and charging, as was common. They could do all sorts of organizational drills and things like that that other city-states couldn't do. So it was evident they did do some military training. Women Spartiates actually had more rights than other women in ancient Greece. In fact, in Athens, for all of their talk about freedom for everyone, women couldn't go out in public without a male sponsor, or else they'd be whipped or put to jail, or even in some cases put to death. Now, in addition to tending to their home, because the soldier was supposed to go off at war, Spartan women could complete business deals and actually own land for themselves. Spartan women did do regular physical training to keep in shape to fight in case the men failed in their duties to save Sparta, and it would come down to the women to defend the city-state. Now, in this painting, which is considered a pretty idealized version of life in Sparta, was that the woman loved the man so much, and when he sent him off to battle, it says either come back with your shield or on it. In other words, go out and die for your city-state or come back alive. The Spartan woman's job was to raise children to become future Spartiates, because the population, if you remember, was so dominated by the Helots. So they were kind of stuck in a siege mentality with regards to that. So in our next section, we're going to take all this information about Sparta and we're going to compare it to the city-state we already talked about, Athens. So Athens and Sparta were the two most powerful city-states in ancient Greece, and as a result they became fierce rivals and fought for control of all of Greece. Athenian writers wrote extensively about Spartan government and society, and they talked about the differences between them. Now, just a little thing for all you historians out there is that a lot of the major sources we use to talk about the Spartans come from Athenian authors, and we have to remember that because they were major rivals, their writings probably were colored by that bias they had against Sparta. But they were still fascinated with them, just like how we are today. Now, one thing was the government. Athens did have their democracy, which we talked about in our last video. Sparta had a government that consisted of several branches. It had two kings, an assembly elected by the Spartiates, and a group of elders who were appointed by the kings over the age of 60 who were supposed to serve a supervisory role. So let's go ahead and let's start our graphic organizer here. So the question is, what's the best form of government? Well, the Athenians would say it was a government where the citizens worked together to make decisions in a democracy. The Spartans said, no, we got to have limits on power. You needed different branches, including a monarchy, and the two kings were from the two founding families of Sparta, a representative body elected by the Spartiate citizens, and in a group of elders who were supposed to be the older and wiser members of society who could help make decisions that maybe younger people were making much too rash. The second one was that Sparta valued things that were practical above everything else. They even built little to no buildings that would last in their city. The only part of ancient Sparta discovered by archaeologists is a small theater where the government would meet, which you see right here. And so apart from a couple other smaller buildings, this is the biggest structure left of the Spartan city-state. Whereas on the other hand, in Athens, you have the Acropolis, which is in the Parthenon, which is a whole structure and civic center that we find, along with all sorts of archaeological discoveries throughout the entire city of Athens. Sparta just doesn't have that. The reason why is, what's the purpose of building and goods made for society? Sparta said said it should only be practical, and if it's built to last, it's because you want it built to last. Athens, on the other hand, would say that everything should be built to last, but also be attractive and show the power of Athens. And the final one is that, unlike Athens, the purpose of the citizen in Sparta was said to serve the Spartan government. In Athens, it was completely the opposite, and something that us in the West would probably be more familiar with. In Athens, it was said that the government existed only because the individual citizens allowed it to exist. In other words, if they didn't want it, it wouldn't be there. Finally, what's the role of the citizen in government? Athens would say something that we would say. The citizen is the basis of the government's authority, and without the citizens, the government itself can't work. Sparta would say the complete opposite. The citizen exists to serve the government. Without the government, citizens wouldn't have anything to do. The freedom a person has depends on the needs of the government. As you can see, the wealthiest and most powerful Spartiates had the most freedom. The ones who had the least power, the Helots, had no freedom at all because their purpose was to work. In our final section, we're going to talk about what was the actual legacy Sparta left to us today. So in our final section, we're going to talk about Sparta's legacy. Now, even though it didn't leave very many buildings or writings that they wrote themselves, Sparta definitely left an indelible mark on Western society. People even today admire the rigid order of Spartan society, the love of physical activity and bravery in battles, such as displayed at Thermopylae, where, we still see it in the movie 300, with King Leonidas. In addition, not only this military thing, but the Spartan fondness for responding to questions with short answers today is known as having what we call a laconic wit. Now, laconic comes from Lacedaemon, which is the name for the region which Sparta was settled. A good example of this is when the Persians demanded that the Spartans surrender their weapons before the Battle of Thermopylae. No, Leonidas didn't say, "This is Sparta," and kick the guy into the well. Rather, he described it with the term, "Come and take them." And the laconic wit, what we talk about today, is when someone asks you a question, you give a short answer that gets directly to the point, which is, I guess, what I should do to finish up this lesson. So to sum up, Sparta was really different from Athens. It was based totally on the government having a society built to keep it going and defending it to the military. The Spartiates held all the power. They only survived through a very brutal regime of oppressing their Helot slaves. They were very effective in battle, and in fact, held on for a good 150 years as one of the dominant city-states in ancient Greece. However, by the time Alexander the Great had come around, they were on the wane, though Alexander the Great actually never really conquered them. But by the time the Romans took them over in 150 BC, they were a shadow of their former selves, though we like to remember them today as these unbeatable warriors. So there you go. That's your lesson. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. And as always, please let me know, and thanks for watching.